Okay, so welcome to members who've been here a long time, which I see lots of people, and to some people who I have not seen before. Welcome, welcome. Okay. Oh yeah, right. Says like you're shy. Okay. So anyway, um, okay. So anyway, um, I also ask questions. Okay. So why am I doing a presentation on Artemis II? I could be doing one on the Olympics. Olympics is pretty cool. I even saw one on the physics of ice skating. I thought that was neat. Hi, Gaz. Yeah, okay, so in other words, everybody should be going like, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, and having the TV on, at least in the 60s, which we had one black and white television in the living room, like a lot of people in 68, 69, this is the first time that anyone has tried to have people go back to the moon in 50, what is it, nearly 54, 55, nearly 55 years, over 50 years. Okay, the last one was in 1972. In fact, I'll talk about the Apollo missions first to do a little context, and then talk about specifically about Artemis II. And Artemis II has, what they're trying to do is, well, tell you what, let me dig in here on the slides, and then we'll talk about Artemis II itself. Yeah, I know, but I was there, okay? And a lot of us were, I tag. And I remember them very clearly. I was in the living room, and when they landed on the moon, I stayed up most of the night. When they landed on the moon, I scratched the exact date and time into the furniture. Yeah, I was too old. Oh, okay, cool. But I think they were watching it in Germany. In fact, actually, the Apollo 11 landing is still the most, based on the percentage of people on Earth watching it, is still the most watched show on television, period, in history. Yeah, televisions in bars. Okay, so let's take a look. Let's do some context. The Apollo missions ran from 1967 to 1972. Yeah, Bonanza. Okay, got it. Well, yeah. Okay, and there are people that didn't think we actually landed on the moon either, and probably won't this time. So they'd rather watch I don't know, whatever, reality TV. But this is reality TV, folks. Okay, so in the Apollo missions, they started 1967 to 1972. Let's kind of take a look down through there. And those are really small writing, so I'm going to read a little bit of it. But basically, the Apollo mission, back, what happened in 1979? Yeah, little Joe Cartwright. Yeah. How about Fess Parker? I actually saw Lauren Green at a restaurant once in Hawaii. Okay. So, fellow Canadian, exactly. There you go. Okay, so anyway, back in 1957, monumentous event, namely the first satellite went into orbit, Sputnik, beep, 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 around the Earth. And then you had efforts to try to get people into space with one person, two people, three people in the spacecraft. And so in Apollo, the idea was there was three people in there and they were wanting to go to the moon. And it was conceived as a follow-on project as early as 1960 by then U.S. President Kennedy. And the primary goal back for the Apollo missions and all that was basically to duke it out with the Soviet Union without actually duking it out. In other words, establish technological superiority over the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union had already launched the first satellite. They launched the first person in space. They did the first spacewalks. A lot of firsts. First women. And so the U.S. wanted to try to catch up with them technologically, and one of the ways they did or wanted to do so was in space. So in April of 1961, after the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin, who was the first person to fly into space, in May, the month later, then President Kennedy challenged the U.S. and says, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. And the rest of that basically goes, and we do this and all that stuff, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. It's a challenge. Okay. So, then the Apollo missions began, and unfortunately the first one began in a so the first one began with a catastrophic fire that killed all 3 astronauts. Not a great way to begin either. I'm sure the astronauts would agree with that. And so in order to honor the astronauts, Apollo 2 and 3 did not launch. Essentially, 1, 2, and 3 were in commemoration of the 3 astronauts that died. So the next Apollo was Apollo 4. And Apollo 4, 5, 6 were uncrewed flights in order to test the rocket, the command ship, the landing craft, all that good stuff. And it wasn't until Apollo 7 that they had a crewed, I don't mean C-R-U-D-E, although it was pretty C-R-U-D-E back then, but they had a command service module that had people in it. And then, we've actually discussed that quite a bit in the Moon Group about why and all that stuff. And they had to do a lot of changes inside the command module in addition to the atmosphere leaked, or the atmosphere mixture and all that good stuff like that. Even though the people that go out for spacewalks, they still get about an hour of pure oxygen, okay, in order to purge things so they don't get the bends when they're doing the spacewalk in case there's a little leak, that sort of thing. Okay, so Apollo 8, which is the one that's similar to Artemis II, and that's the reason why I'm putting this in context, went around the moon. It was spectacular. December, they took the picture of the big blue marble and all that good stuff, and it really changed people's views of what the Earth and how fragile it was, and in a way led to things like the environmental acts and Earth Day, which was in 1970, which I remember well, and things like that. In other words, looking back at our tiny little blue dot and how extraordinary it was compared to, say, the lifeless moon. Okay, by the way, this isn't a presentation on Apollo 8, but there is a little caveat on there. The Soviet Union actually launched a craft towards the moon, and it had a recording on the craft that made it seem as if they were landing on the moon. And so Houston was getting this recording. They were going, oh my goodness, they're going to beat us to the moon. And I thought that was if you look at the whole history of Apollo 8, it was very fascinating. Okay, so anyway, Apollo 9 then went up, and then they had to do the docking maneuver. In other words, there was a landing craft and the command service craft, and they had to make sure they docked, which is exactly what Apollo or Artemis II is going to do on the mission. They're just kind of condensing several missions all in once. And then Apollo 10 went up and descended to 15 kilometers from the surface, came back up. I'll bet you they were disappointed they weren't able to land. But in other words, they did all of what was needed for Apollo 11 to be successful. Apollo 11, of course, landed, and then you had the Apollo 12 through 17 missions. Okay, another question. What was special about the Apollo 13, and particularly how they went around the moon? Because this has to do with Artemis II as well. So what did Apollo 13 do that was different than some of the other trajectories? Anybody remember? Well, okay. Oh, okay, they did. Okay, so there was the malfunction was actually a oxygen tank that blew, um, and they returned without landing. But what they did do is they didn't go into orbit there. What they did do was go into what's called a free return trajectory. They fired the engine well out from the moon, and it got them to where they could go around the moon and return to Earth without any major burn around the other side of the moon. Apollo 8 had to do a burn around the other side of the moon out of communication range of Houston. So it was very tricky when they came around the other side, and they go, okay, great, that burn went really well. There, Gus, of course, has the details, where you had a spark, essentially, and it blew, because they were stirring the oxygen, which was something that they needed to do. So yeah, thank you for the detail there. Okay, so anyway, yeah, I'm reading the chat here with what Baragon has said. Yeah, they did have to do some maneuvering that was unexpected. Okay. Oh, further up, I've got. Well, we don't have the chat extender thing, but I may be sitting right where I see that Baragon's out of range, but I can see his thing. If you didn't catch it, let me just put that in chat again, because I think it's worth repeating here. Okay. Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you. Okay. So anyway, there were several ways that they could have landed and come back. One was essentially, now tell me who actually is planning this one. It's what's called direct descent. You launch in one big rocket, go straight to the moon and land, and then come back without any need for several rockets and et cetera, like that. Okay, so if you don't recognize that one, that's what SpaceX wants to do. They've got that big rocket and the Starship and all that. And so what they're actually planning is they're planning to go to Mars, but they're one of the companies that has been subcontracted to build a lunar lander also. So instead of having a lander like this on the Apollo mission, the lander would actually go into lunar orbit, and the Orion spacecraft on the Artemis II would catch up with it. They would transfer over to the SpaceX ship and then land on the moon, come back up, and then transfer back again, that sort of thing. Or maybe transfer back. I don't know quite how it works, because Artemis III is still a bit in the future because none of that's been figured out yet. Okay, so the other thing they could do is an Earth orbit rendezvous, which means multiple launches in parts, and then assemble things there. You know, what could go wrong, and then go to the moon and all that good stuff, and land and come back. Okay, or do a lunar surface rendezvous, namely send a fuel rocket to the moon and transfer fuel there. Now the problem with that is that the Japanese mission was the only one that came even close to landing, and theirs was considered a close landing to where they wanted to land. In other words, landing that fuel rocket a kilometer away wouldn't help very much in that case. So they figured on doing a lunar orbit rendezvous. That is, you launch, you detach the lander, you stick it on the command module, you go there, you transfer to the lander, you go down to the moon, you come back up, you transfer back to the command module, and then return to Earth. So that's what the Apollo missions did. So there's several ways to do this. Okay, so now you've got the these are where the locations of where the different Apollo landers landed. And for people that are in the moon base group, if you look right in the middle there, that dark spot in the middle that's to the right of where it says 12 and 14, is where our space elevator hub would be, or the Selene moon base, okay, which was actually one of the alternative Apollo landing sites. And then over on the right, you see an early version in the 60s of them talking about the idea of having the lander and how they would do this in the Apollo missions. Okay, so now let's talk about Artemis. But I needed to give you some background for people that are not, that did not have the advantage of being there at the time. Okay, Jackson, that's an excellent question. If you did a space elevator here on Earth because of the gravity, you would need something that we don't have yet. In other words, something that doesn't exist. In other words, a big, fine thread of graphene that would actually vary in diameter and all that good, possibly carbon fiber. But we actually, because the moon's gravity is only 1/6 of the Earth, we actually have things like carbon fiber and stuff that could make a space elevator cable. The problem is the cable has to be about 65,000 kilometers long. And we haven't quite been able to extrude a cable 65,000 kilometers long. Okay, yeah. Or Kevlar, yeah, there's the other substance. This in itself, the idea of the moon elevator, we've talked a lot in the moon base meeting, but it could definitely be a presentation in and of itself. Okay, so let's take a look at the Artemis missions. Now, note also, for particularly, is that the Artemis missions actually began as a, back in the 2000s, at around the same time as the Chinese began their landings. But it was only NASA, again, and so what they decided, and then it became too expensive, so what they decided to do is, let's go out and we're going to talk to the European Space Agency, and we're going to talk to Japan and Canada, and to, who am I missing? Oh yeah, commercial. So in other words, like SpaceX, or what's the other one? The Blue Origin? Is that the other company that they're contracting with right now? Yeah, Blue Origin. Okay. So the so in other words, let's split this up so that it's not just a U.S. government mission, but it involves a lot of other people, so we can split up the money a little bit too, and all that good stuff. So you have both the ESA and NASA as the main agents here for the Artemis part of it. Yeah, billionaire rocketry, exactly. Okay, so let's take a look then at that. Okay, so in the Artemis missions, you've got the Artemis program was established then in 2017 to, by the way, that's Artemis 1 over there on the far side of the moon. And so the actual goal then is to establish a human presence on the moon again, on the moon, and to create a permanent base there, and then basically to facilitate missions to Mars. So that's a lot more involved than 50 years ago with the Apollo missions, which essentially just the U.S. beating Soviet Union or something. But does anyone know why the Soviet Union did not get to the moon? There's a pretty simple reason, actually. I mean, it wasn't that they didn't have the technology, etc., but there was one place where technology failed. Does anybody happen to know? Yeah, the booster rockets, the big rocket. They had a rocket that was ready to go, and they just couldn't, because it was back in pre-computer days. They couldn't get them all to fire at the same time and keep sustained. Now, SpaceX, of course, since they've got the wrong terminology, Bugs Bunny. Okay, if anybody's old enough to remember the Bugs Bunny cartoons, Albuquerque. Okay, so anyway, they could have done it. It's just that they couldn't get all the 31 different rockets or whatever to all go off at the same time. Okay, so let's. So the purpose of Artemis II itself is, in NASA language here, is to verify human capabilities in deep space and pave the way for long-term exploration science on the lunar surface. So what they're going to do is they're going to test the equipment and the maneuvers that, like Apollo 10, Apollo 9, 7, all those people tested, that Artemis II crew will need to land on the moon. The only thing missing is the landing craft. Okay. Which, of course, is a pretty big deal. Okay, I see a question mark. Let's see. Why are we researching how to land us? Well, because everybody in the 60s there is dead, or pretty much. And so we have to reinvent the wheel. Now, that's not quite totally true. Because actually where I live up in the Texas Hill Country, and there's a lot of people that like to retire up here. It actually has more millionaires per capita than any other place in Texas. And over at one of the assisted living place, well, you're right, and he's in his like 90, I'm trying to remember, but oh, thank you. Okay, so I tried to make good slides. That's your encouragement. So anyway, over at one of the assisted living places where I go and do presentations like this. In fact, actually, this presentation, I'm going to do it on the first week of March before the Artemis II lands, is we have the assistant flight director, who's also in his 90s, or his 89, I think, who was the assistant flight director at Houston Control during the Apollo 11, 13, 8 missions. Okay, so he's seen all this from Houston Control. There's also the grandson of Alan Shepard. Anyone know who Alan Shepard was? Well, now, okay, he was the first American guy in space. Yuri Gagarin was the first person. But Alan Shepard was the first person to do suborbital flight, and then first astronaut in space. And then John Glenn was the first person to orbit. So not everybody remembers who Alan Shepard was. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so anyway, on the Artemis II missions, by the way, if this were the Apollo mission, there'd be 137 of the steps up there. They had their own profile, and there was 137 steps. Now, I'll go through a little bit about what they're actually doing. Over on the right are some of the maneuvers they're going to do in space. If you look over on the left and you see that orange 6, they're going to test the different maneuvers over there in the orange box on the right in order to make sure that they know how to separate and dock and move around and test the thrusters and do everything that they're going to need to do for the Artemis III mission, which we're not sure when. That may be at least next year or more. They got to get a lander first. That's interesting, Baragon. Now, let's see, moon launch for this month. Well, they were going to launch in, okay, if you're talking about Artemis II, they were going to launch in February, but they had the hydrogen leak, and they needed to fix that. So they went ahead and said, okay, let's do it in March, or possibly March. Well, except that China is doing one of these slow but sures. In other words, every mission that they've had since 2007, I believe, where they did their first Chang'e, I butchered Chinese, I'm sure right there, 1, and now they're up to 6, has been on time, and it's done exactly what it's supposed to do, and they landed last time on the far side of the moon, had a rover, picked up rocks, brought them back to Earth, that sort of thing. Well, I don't know yet. Okay. So in other words, we'll see. Okay. But anyway, the Artemis II. Let me go over the flight profile of the Artemis II, and then I'll show you what's inside the craft and all that good stuff like that. Okay, so first of all, these are the two different rockets. This is 50 years difference here. or more. So you've got the two different rockets. The Apollo one was actually a little bigger than the Space Launch System, but they were comparable. And an upgraded version of the Space Launch System, like I think Space Launch System 2 or whatever, can carry a bit more payload, but they don't need it to carry any more payload than they need right now, okay, because things are a bit more miniaturized and stuff like that, whatever. And you notice it still has a lot of thrust, and they're using the solid boosters that were successful on the space shuttles to get them up in orbit, and the same ones that SpaceX is using, that sort of thing. I don't know that they're the same thing, but the same idea. Well, they are. They're solid fuel thrusters, which is fine, you know, because if you don't, and they probably give a little more oomph or whatever, maybe Cisnos or Gus. Well, yes. I don't see any of this as being safe. In fact, Apollo 8, I think it was Apollo 8 or Apollo 11, even the astronauts only gave it a 50-50 chance of them coming back alive to Earth. So, you know, you pay your money, you take your chances, pay whatever, that sort of thing. Plus, you know, they were military people. They knew what dangers they faced, okay? Now, here's what's going to happen on Artemis II. So it launches, and they go up into orbit. Okay, good, Gus. Yeah, anyone who knows something about the actual rockets. Yeah, car fuel. Okay. Yeah, last thing we want is an explosion at a fueling station on a car. Okay, so when they launch, see where I've got that red circle? They're going to do their practice maneuvers there. That's when they're going to practice everything when they're safe to Earth, and they could even come back if they need to with their command module. And not go to the moon if they, for example, can't dock again or things like that. So the idea, sure you didn't want me here, me cough. Okay, so anyway, and then they're going to go into this big elliptical orbit that's out at 74,000 kilometers. That's a hefty amount away from Earth, and then come back in kind of screaming at 185 kilometers, and then zoom out toward the moon. And at one point, when it's just right, they're going to do a translunar injection. I remember that on the Apollo missions where they go, you know, go for TLI, translunar injection. So on that phase, then, that upper stage you can see that's connected, the part to the left of the solar panels are going to rocket off. That's where you're going to get some a good long burn that's going to pick up speed from 26,000 kilometers per second per minute, excuse me, to 36,000 kilometers per minute, which they need to escape Earth's gravity. Otherwise, they're stuck in Earth orbit. Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly. For tagline said. In other words, once you light the big firecracker, it's going. it's going up. Okay, so let's look at this is what Apollo 13. They did a burn so that they could go into what's called free return trajectory. The Apollo 11 actually was on a similar trajectory. The first Apollos were on this one, so in case they didn't get the proper burn near the moon, then they wouldn't just wander off into space. They don't need to do a big burn. All that they did do is little thrusters for correction, so they go looping around and then come back and land on the Earth. 4 days there, 4 days back. And Apollo 8 went a considerable distance because they're doing the loop around the moon instead of going into orbit. Apollo 8 actually did the farthest away from the moon that any human has done. No, Apollo 13, sorry. did the farthest away from the moon, because 8 actually went in orbit and then came back, I think. I'm pretty sure. But 13 went around, and they were the furthest away from the moon and Earth than any human, but now Artemis II is going to go further. It's going to go out up to 6,500 kilometers on the other side of the moon and then come back in a big loop. And that will place it. And so you have to be, it's a coplanar burn, and so it has to be just right. That's why there's particular times where they're going to do the burn so that they can be in just the right orbit so they can come back to Earth without expending a lot of fuel, which means they don't have to take the fuel to expand, lighter load. Okay, so now let's take a look at Apollo and Artemis. And I've got some good pictures inside Artemis. And so let's take a look at okay, so here's the two different spacecraft. Apollo there, you can notice that it was about 4 meters across with 3 astronauts, and Orion's about 5 meters across with 4 astronauts. They always like to name these ones, you know, like when they said Eagle has landed, the Eagle's landed, that sort of thing. So their command or the lunar module is named Eagle. While the Orion capsule, they don't have any lander. The Orion capsule, why do they need 4? Oh, I don't know, so that they can have more expertise on different areas, is what I would think. Yeah, the mascons, on on Artemis 1, they had the mannequins that were testing out equipment disguised in a well, you know, but you know, 4 people, you've got more room for expertise. Okay, essentially, up there. Wow, that could be too. There you go. That could be the disguise part of it. They're psychologists. Okay, so anyway, but I've got a picture of the astronauts too. Okay. So anyway, this is what the two are named. I mean, what the two look like, and then the command module's named Integrity. Okay, what a difference 50 years can make. Well, it's interesting you said that, Mike. You know, on the space shuttles, they had 5 redundant computers, or at least 5 total, that were all redundant. So if one broke, or had a hiccup, they could switch to other ones. In the Apollo spacecraft, you'll notice that, or went rogue, you know, early AI, I guess. Okay, so you'll notice on the Apollo one, that doesn't look very comfortable. It was like, what, canvas or wooden seats or some other thing. And so you've got 3 people staring at a huge instrument panel. You'll notice that this was pre-digital, quite a ways before the digital displays, integrated circuits. I mean, it was really primitive in there, and so you've got a lot of little switches and stuff like that. Well, that's correct. 2001, like 2001 Space Odyssey, was far in the future. I should have put a picture of 2001 Space Odyssey in here. But in the Orion capsule, because they didn't have to have all that big panel and wiring and all that, it looks much more comfortable over in the Apollo. Now, comfort is a relative term, considering you've got a 5 meter across capsule where you've got 4 people that are going to spend up to 3 weeks. The mission's only really about 2 weeks, but both their survival gear, suits, and the capsule is equipped for 3 weeks. Okay? If you Google and you look up for YouTube how to fly the Orion spacecraft, there is a cool YouTube where the 2 pilots talk about how they fly this thing, and it's really neat. Okay, so you can look at that now. Okay, so what is inside the Orion capsule compared to the ancient Apollo capsules? Well, there's probably a driver's manual, but you know that these guys have done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of simulators, okay, in order to, so by the time they get in there, in craft that already look like this, they've got mock-up craft Be sure to kick the tires, before lighting the fires and all that good stuff. Okay, so this is what it looks like inside the Orion spacecraft. Isn't this cool? It's got, so up on the top there, you've got these hammocks for sleeping, and you'll notice you could take off your outer gear and put your little mask on, and this is not too different than what's on the International Space Station, where essentially they have a little bedroom, so to speak, and everybody gets a little cot, and you can string up the cot. Yeah, exactly. It's a camper. Well, yeah, exactly. Okay, but that's not bad. You can get some decent sleep and all that good stuff like that. Now, here's the biggie. Here's a couple really cool things. Go down to the bottom one. Yes, it's a unisex bathroom, but it's a bathroom. Okay, and I'll tell you about it here in a second. This is cool because you have 4 people that are going to be in there for up to 3 weeks or 2 weeks, and you can't hold it for 2 weeks. Okay, so what they have is, that's essentially a diaper change station as well. But let me show you the one on the bottom left first, with the guys with the helmets, because that isn't the astronauts. This is a mock-up of the capsule where they're testing everything out, and they don't have all those cables running in there either. But what they actually have is they actually have a little space that they can go into, and then they put these big, heavy they put these anti-radiation, they look like seat cushions, over the top of them, so you can have 4 people in this little space with the anti-radiation. Yes, that's exactly right. I hope, is it Andre? That is what that's for. In other words, if they have a solar flare, they go into this little shelter, and they put those anti-radiation things over the top of them. I'm not sure what a Carrington event is, but if they do have well, Brianne, that's an excellent question, and I hope that they have hardened the electronics. A super solar. Well, okay, if that would be a bad thing, then I suppose. If they did that, I think they'd just want to come home. Life in a toaster. Yes. Okay. Brianne asked, let's see, about protected electronics. Yeah, I just hope that they have them, they spent the money to have hardened systems. I don't know. Oh, a chessboard? Well, you never know, Tag. That's a great idea. Or at least, okay, I'll tell you what, you don't have to have a chess set. What you can have is they've got digital display. And so you have, 3D chess, there you go. So you have a digital display. I wouldn't put it past them to have 2 of the monitors there as chess sets, In other words, so they could play each other, or even video games, It doesn't cost any more money to do that. It doesn't take up any more weight to do that. So anyway, okay, let's go over to the bathroom side. Yeah, I am each other. Bring up their little phones. I don't think so. But in any case, take selfies. So anyway, over on the toilet side, you've actually got a door, like going into a shower. Okay, this is cool. And on the left is, there's a YouTube video on this also, but it's exercise equipment. So essentially, it's what they do is they that's the base, and the base comes down, and then they stand on the base and they hold on to this bar and pull up. So it's like as if you're lifting weights or resistance and stuff like that. And so in order to keep muscle tone, since everybody knows that if you're off in weightless space that you're going to lose everything from calcium in your bones to muscle tone and everything else, so that they need to for health to keep in shape and to have resistance and things like that for their bones and muscles and everything else. Okay, so that's exercise equipment. Then you open up the door, you go in, you go to the toilet. Okay, that toilet, and you shut the door, curtain, whatever, and that toilet is 2/3 the size of the one on the International Space Station. Okay, call me Gus. Okay. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? Okay, and I think I'm going to run out of slides before I run out of talking, because this is the last slide. And this is the crew, the Apollo 8 crew over there on the left with Jim Lovell and others. I don't remember the other guys' names. And then the Artemis crew. Now, on the Artemis crew, you have two pilots, test pilots, who've flown many types of aircraft before, and one of them is from Canada. You can see over on the Canadian patch over on his arm on the far right. And you have other mission specialists who have been all hold advanced degrees, all hold lots and lots of different kinds of. Yeah, I don't know about the suit colors. I don't know why they're orange or whatever. Maybe it's easier to see them. I don't know. Tang, I mean, whatever. But they went to orange. And so the two mission specialists, I should have brought in what their biographies are, darn it. Orange is the New Black. Oh, that very clever, Ben. Hunting season. Okay, but in any case, they have a lot of hours. Like, for example, the woman astronaut, or female astronaut, she has more hours in space than any other woman. She was on the ISS for a year or so. And the guy in back, oh, the orange, I don't know. The guy in back has, he's a colonel flown in I don't know how many aircraft and has a lot of experience. In other words, they didn't just flip a coin and pick this group. This is the best of the best group that they could pick that have many hours and mission specialists and that kind of stuff like that. Well, you never know, Sumo. Orange is certainly visible. Okay, so rarely do I actually run out of slides before I run out of time. Maybe I talk fast or didn't practice because I didn't think I was going to be here. But now's the time you guys could talk or chat. Anybody have any comments, questions, etc.? Nothing rhymes with orange? Oh, okay. Maybe they wanted to pick something other than red, white, and blue. Oh, that's interesting, Mike. I know that they have, oh, now, what they have is, this is a survival suit. This is different. This is a suit where they could actually stay in for 2 weeks, okay? This is a special suit that they have created in case they have an Apollo 13 moment, where they lose all oxygen, lose all of that sort of stuff. They can actually survive in this suit for like 2 weeks. Let's see. Okay, so I'm getting some. Okay, Brittany asks, will the spacecraft splash down or parachute on land? Okay, on the Soviet ones, or the Russians, because they are at the latitude they are, and there's not a lot of water up there that is free of ice year round, etc. They land on the land. For the U.S. missions, they land on the ocean and get picked up by a small carrier, like a helicopter carrier, and that's what they're going to do in the Pacific Ocean, just like they did in the Apollo days. That's right. And yes, it could very well be that orange is for visibility. Maybe when they're walking on the moon, too. Maybe it... maybe it's... I'm reading the chat. Okay, so good questions. Okay, Brittany asks some relevant questions here. What will Artemis III do, and when is the first planned moon landing? Okay, Artemis III is supposed to be like Apollo 11, except they're going to stay longer and do more. And they have 4 people, and they're all going to land, not just 2 of them. So, but what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to go up there with the Orion capsule, just like Artemis II. In other words, Artemis II is practicing everything they're supposed to do. They're supposed to go up there. They're supposed to dock with the landing craft. In this case, there are 2 companies which have been contracted to make a landing craft for the moon. SpaceX and Blue Origin. Neither of them have a landing craft yet. So you can imagine that what they're going to have to, and then so it launches totally separately, goes up there, land, and then goes into orbit, and then the Orion capsule is going to have to dock with it, transfer over to the landing craft. Landing craft then goes down and lands on the moon. But none of that's even close to happening yet, so we're not sure when. Well, almost says, in other words, they're going to be there for a little while. And they're going to do lots of missions. I guess, if you're going to go back to the moon, you may as well stay there for a little bit. Look around, do things. But that's what's going to happen. So we don't know. The earliest that Artemis III could possibly happen would be 2027, except that no one's landed on the moon, with a landing craft. No one's made a landing craft yet. So, yeah. Anyone else? I've got some new faces out there. Any questions? If you want to do chat or voice, that's fine too. Okay, so the reason why I did a presentation on Artemis, Brittany, that's an excellent question, and I imagine the answer is absolutely yes. The communications have come a long way since the 50s. Have you ever seen what size the telephone or the television cameras were in Vietnam? These huge monster things that you had to hold on your shoulder. So yes, I imagine it would be easy to take something like a cell phone or, NASA version of a cell phone. Cell phones don't do very well in 250 degrees centigrade or minus 150 centigrade. So it's going to have to be a, more bandwidth and a camera that can survive lunar temperatures and radiation. So you're not talking a cheap camera. But yeah, absolutely. I'm certain they're going to do selfies and all kinds of videos up there. I would imagine that they'll probably put them on different, YouTube, other channels. Everybody else puts it on YouTube. Okay, tagline. Artemis is the sister. Okay, who's got Greek mythology? Artemis is the sister of Apollo, I think. So that's why they picked Artemis. Does anyone, can anybody verify that? Well, yeah. Okay, goddess of the moon and stuff. But I think Apollo's twin. Oh, tagline. Good for you. Okay, so I knew that Artemis and Apollo were related in Greek mythology. Yeah, and then moon goddess and stuff. Which, by the way, on the Chinese missions, it's officially called the CLEP, or Chinese Lunar Exploration Program, but the actual spacecraft are named like that. Okay, So that's the or like this. I'm trying to remember. Anybody? I did a presentation on it. Yeah, Mike, actually, that's a alternate for Selene. Okay, so anyway, at about 7 something Central Time, middle of the U.S. time, on March 6th is the first next window when they could launch. Bear in mind, of course, they launch, do the maneuvers, go into high orbit, etc., 4 ways. So in other words, it'll be 4 or 5 days to the moon, and then 4 or so days back. But that's the next window. They also said, don't be surprised if it doesn't launch, because they're not going to go up there and fail. Okay, they're going to go up there with every intention of checking everything possible to make sure that they go up, stay safe, come back. Okay, anyone else? No one says we have to stay here an hour. Anyone else that would like to volunteer anything, or any interests out there with the moon? Lots and lots and lots, Brittany. I don't know. That's well, thank you, Sumo. Here again, this is on Artemis II, but you know that I'm going to do Artemis 3 coming up sometime. Oh, now the one thing, I don't know whether they're going to do this on the Artemis mission, but on Artemis 1, what was also, there was about 10 or 12 of these, that they weren't stowaways, but what did they bring along with them in the rocket part? Oh, now, okay, they had the mannequins, but in the rocket part itself, they had those. What are the tiny little satellites that are only like a couple kilograms called? In other words, where it costs maybe CubeSats. Lots of CubeSats, yes. CubeSat costs as little as $100,000. So that means actually a university can get a grant for making a CubeSat to do something. Or other nations. There's several nations and universities and others that have sent CubeSats along with some of the major missions. Well, thank you, Andre. I hope like I said, pronounce that correctly. Rubik's Cubes. Yeah, exactly. Well, they look like them. So, yeah. Okay, another question, and then we can go. Let's see. Planes. Does something to cars? What is necessary progress instead of giving money to other companies who are farther advanced? Because they can. I don't know. But is that when you get a commercial company involved, you've got lots of other issues. So, what if they don't, what if it isn't compatible? I remember one of the Mars missions that they had different people making stuff, and one of the measurements was in metric and the other was in imperial measurements or US measurements or whatever, and it crashed into Mars, and they found out the reason being is because they didn't use the same measurement system. It's like, oops, that was a couple $2 billion that crashed into Mars. Okay, yes, and we're going to quit, and well, they do contract. In other words, these missions are made by all the states and everything, and I'm certain that, and of course, you got the ESA there where all the countries are involved, and Canada and everything, so this is more than just a company or NASA or anybody else. Okay, take care, have fun. If you want to come back, take a look at the slides, thank you, everybody. They're ringing the amphitheater. If you have any questions? Yeah, thank you. I like doing this, and I learned. You know, you got to learn to do the to be able to do the presentation. Okay.